YouTube, Facebook channel stuff going on.
Welcome.
YV.
Yeah. Behind the scenes with the Run With It podcast, we've got Daniel H. Galancy here. We're going to talk about flying cars. Super exciting. If you'd like to listen to the edited version of this podcast, subscribe to us on your podcast player of choice. This is behind the scenes, as I mentioned. So we may go on some asides that are going to get cleaned up, and you'll get a really concise package if you listen to it when it's released via your podcast player. Would welcome any feedback that you guys have. Also, if you want to comment on the post or email us at update@runwithit.fm, we'd love to hear from you. You guys ready?
Ready to go.
Ready. Let's do it. Welcome to Run With It, the show that brings you untapped business ideas from successful entrepreneurs. My name is Chris Justin, and I'm here with Ethan Janney. Ethan, how's it going?
It's going well, man. I got a hole in my sweater, and I'm proud of it.
I would love to talk about the hole in your sweater, but I'm much more excited to talk about the concept of today's podcast. It's been, 78 episodes, maybe 79. I think this will be the 79th episode, and it's taken us that long to get to flying cars. I feel like we're, remiss in that. How has that happened?
There's a time and a place for everything, Chris.
I think that the right time and the right place would be
the right time and the right place to be now. We're going to talk with our guest today, Daniel H. Galancy. He's the CEO of Atacama, an NYC-based software company, and uses his deep experience with blockchain tech to help companies manage security. And yeah, Daniel's here to talk to us about starting a flying car company. Why do you think this idea rose to the top for you for the episode today, Daniel?
This is an idea that I've had in my head since I was a child, and I maybe I can blame the Jetsons for it. Maybe I can just blame overall childhood for it. But these ideas that you have in your head from when you're a kid, most people sort of say to themselves when they hit adulthood, of course that's completely unrealistic. That would never happen. Nobody would ever do that. But then, having become an entrepreneur myself, I've begun to say to myself, anything is possible. And things that I had thought in the past were totally absurd, I've watched other entrepreneurs, successfully do. So you have to sort of say to yourself, why not? And then you have to go through all the steps of thinking more carefully about the idea, validating it, see what the difficult parts will be, et cetera, et cetera.
You know what? I'm going to cut in real quick. Just go off the topic just for 1 second. Can you think of an example of something that another entrepreneur did that makes you up-level your sense of what's possible?
Sure. Oh man. Trying to think of a great.
Are we talking just
example.
Kind of general, like Elon Musk going to Mars stuff? Is it you were hanging out with your friends and one day they were talking about something crazy, and then 5 years later they making $1 million off of it? Is it more of a personal experience, or do you find that it was
both?
Yeah.
So the Elon Musk example is very, well known, right? A rocket landing vertically seems absurd. It seems crazy, right? But it's not crazy. The first thing that pops into my head, as strange as it may sound, I spent a lot of time in the Bitcoin world, and when I first started to see successful Bitcoin exchanges pop up in the earlier part of last decade, I said to myself, this is impossible. How can this be? These things are going to get shut down left, right, and center. They're going to get hacked. This bad thing is going to happen. That bad thing is going to happen. It'll never work. It worked. Now, it didn't work for all of them, right? But you have giant ones like Coinbase, right? And it's worked incredibly well. Now, perhaps to a listener or a viewer today, they would say, well, of course that would work, right? Because here we are standing in the year 2021, and it's big and popular, and everyone knows that it works. But if you were standing in 2012, it was not so obvious that these things would survive or that they'd work or that they'd generate a real meaningful amount of revenue.
That's true for many of the biggest businesses today, right? If you think about Amazon, when they got started, people would laugh them out of the room, saying people are going to even put their credit card online at that time, much less buy toilet paper and all the things that we get today. So, yeah, that's certainly a common theme. I think that it would be instructive to get into it with the flying car example, because it's easy. We can always look backward and see all those. That's a common theme. We've heard that a lot. That it's what's obvious in hindsight always feels crazy beforehand, right?
Yeah,
And
I think that's a good transition there is just into like, how do these things happen? People just start talking about the details, right? So that's what we're doing here, right? And in a little bit of research that I found, what are flying cars going for these days? Because there are, prototypes of what a flying car would be. There actually have been some since way back in the 50s when,
That's right.
Henry Ford, thought he could make a flying car for people. But for $500,000 or a little bit above that, you can get yourself a nice, idea of what a flying car could be. We'll put it that way. So I think it's really interesting to just start putting these numbers in place, right? Start thinking about, well, it must not take $500,000 to build it, or maybe it takes more than that now, and people are just sort of raising funds and trying to build a company and put the products out there until they lower the price. It does. I did look at on a website for flying cars, or let's see what they were talking about, a limited edition vehicle called Pioneer, which was selling for $599,000. But they were looking to create another model that they're going to sell for $399,000. So I think just by the process of deduction, we could figure to create a flying car these days, you can probably create one for what, $250,000 to $400,000 maximum. Like, it doesn't have to be that expensive. Do we agree? Do we think that would be unrealistic to think we could build something for that much?
I think before even getting there, what I'd say, what struck me in looking at this is that it's happening now, which, you're talking about people are selling it, one, and then two, it's going to become mass market adopted within 10 years. And that's, very, there's a very high likelihood that happens. That's not a loon shot. Everyone always references the Peter Thiel quote. They promised us flying cars, and instead we got 140 characters. We're actually not that far away from having flying cars. And yeah, the price is almost $600K now for that example that you shared, but it's coming down. It's going to get
I'll give
down
another example.
lower.
Yeah, there's a vehicle called the Jetson, or the company's at least called the Jetson Aero, and it's a little bit more similar to kind of what a drone looks like. It's kind of this quadcopter kind of a deal, and it isn't. I think part of the issue here is that we've got this idea of a flying car, and that people are trying to limit it to it's got to drive on the road and it's got to levitate in some way or fly through the air. I don't know that that's necessary to try to fulfill those two criteria, but that vehicle actually is selling for $59,000. So that's really interesting.
This is a more realistic. I think what you're saying is a more realistic way of looking at the situation. In order to figure out how to get to a point in the future where we will have something new, it's important to look at the rules, air quotes, today, what those rules are, and then how we can break them, right? And I think one of the things that you pointed out is that when people think of flying cars, they think of a traditional flying car. They think of a car, a sedan with wings, right? Maybe the doors become wings, right? Something very straightforward like that. But to your point, it doesn't need to follow all of those rules. We could start with something as goofy sounding as a flying golf cart or a flying Vespa. It doesn't have to be a sedan, right? And it doesn't have to fly with wings. It probably makes much more sense for it to be a quadcopter. So by knowing what the alleged boundaries are, I think that gives you sort of some breathing room and some space to think about how can we violate those boundaries in a productive manner and say to ourselves, how do we achieve our goal, which in my mind is mobility on land, terrestrial mobility, and mobility in air, flight-based mobility in the same vehicle. If that's our goal, what if we just make that our goal and we eliminate all the other nonsense around it?
So you're saying you do want it to be both able to transport you on ground and in the air?
I wanted to be able to do both, but it needn't follow any other rules, right? It
Gotcha.
needn't be a sedan, right? It could be a golf cart,
Right.
right?
That's interesting.
It could be a Vespa, right? It needn't have wings. It could have rotors. You can. I only want this one thing, which is the ability to move on land and the ability to move in air, and I will dispense with any of the other formalities.
That's interesting. I did not encounter many examples that could do both. I was very much locked into this is going to be an air only transport system. There are plenty of examples out there of this existing. I think it would be good to just give a little bit of the lay of the land right now for the listener. So these quadcopters, the reason that this is an opportunity right now and it's becoming more prevalent, there are a number of technological factors that are coming together that are making this possible. So one would be energy storage cost is way lower right now. So battery cost has dropped. And the reason that that's important is for a combustion engine helicopter, it's very heavy. There are a lot of moving parts. It's very expensive. It takes a lot of maintenance to keep them in the air. I came across a stat that helicopters are only in place for 300 to 600 hours per year, and Uber has said that if before they sold off their Elevate business, which we can get to, that for the economics to make sense for them, they need these vehicles in the air for 2,000 hours per year, way higher. And you can't do that with a mechanical or a combustion engine type vehicle. You need way more maintenance. The other thing that is coming together at the same time is autonomous vehicles are becoming more prevalent. The technology needed, computing power and vision, et cetera, to be able to fly autonomously is we're on the verge of that. Tesla is doing that on roads. It's easier to do that in the air because there's a lot less traffic. You don't have balls bouncing in front of your car. You don't have to deal with all the factors of road travel. So that is also happening at the same time. And I'd say that those are the two biggest ones that are leading to this potential right now. Anything else jump out to you guys is why this is such an opportunity?
I was looking over my notes. Did you mention sort of the autonomous factor that we're creating autonomous vehicles now?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. That I think that's the thing. It's like, I don't have to have a helicopter pilot's license to run this thing around. I think what I'm noticing as a big obstacle here, that, like we said, maybe being solved, is just getting it in the hands of the consumer and feeling comfortable that they're not going to kill themselves, and
the safety factor is certainly there. That's yeah. So now that we've kind of taken that full aside, which you've been thinking about this for a long time, Dan, so it's good to get everyone at least close to where you are in thinking about this. This is a big project. This is a big problem. You've created multiple businesses and you've worked on multiple projects over the years. This seems to me at least is way too big to chew off for some individual entrepreneur, certainly for an individual, but even as a first time entrepreneur, second time, third time, I don't know that I would take that on. I mean, it seems crazy.
Well, let's talk about a couple ways to narrow it. Because I think one of the reasons why it seems so daunting is because we all have, or I don't want to say we all have, many people have this image in their in their head of, quite literally a flying car that can go a great distance, that will stay, that is usable for hundreds of hours per year, and meant to stay. It's meant to be constantly on the road, the way people use their sedans in, many major U.S. cities and suburbs. And I'm not sure that's the use case that you'd necessarily want to address first. And if we narrow the use cases a little bit, we may end up with a situation where we have a beachhead, an entry point. And so I'm from New York City, and one of the major issues we have in New York City is mass transit and transportation, getting people from, this is of course before COVID, things have changed materially now, but let's imagine a world that is somewhat similar to what we had in the past, where you have people who live, not at the city center, right? Not in the borough of Manhattan, which is sort of the center of New York City, but rather, 10, 15, 20 miles out. And 20 miles, if you can do, 60 miles an hour without traffic, takes you 20 minutes. It's not going to take 20, it doesn't take 20 minutes to commute in 20 miles away. If you live, 20 miles from Columbus Circle, right? That's not the way it works, right? It'd take you an hour and change.
Yeah, the average traffic speed in downtown Manhattan, I believe, is like 7 miles an hour or something like that.
Yep, and there are some streets that are notoriously terrible. 34th Street is, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but I think it was clocked as the slowest street in New York City at one point. It was some abysmal, low single digit number miles per hour, right? So let's talk about the use case here. And I don't live in the suburbs, but let's pretend for a moment that I do, right? I have a house in the suburbs, and I want to get to the center of the city in a reasonable amount of time, and I want to do this efficiently at a fairly low cost, right? How much time do I really need to be on the road, and how much time do I really need to be in the air? And if we look at that, we can sort of limit the size of the vehicle, right? What we need in the way of battery power, and how we can limit the scope of the whole idea, right? So if I'm in the suburbs, and it's a quadcopter sort of vehicle, I can probably take off from my backyard, right? So I'm in the air immediately. And if I'm only going to travel about 20 miles, right, there's no way that I'm gonna be able to land this thing in the middle of Manhattan. That's not going to happen. But there are heliports, on the East River and on the Hudson River, right? Sort of on the periphery of Manhattan. And if I can land my quadcopter at one of these heliports and then end up on a Vespa like vehicle, right? I've achieved my goal, right? I've cut my commute down materially. And if there's a street with traffic, I may be able to kind of weave in and out of it on what is essentially, like a bike, right? We've narrowed the use case materially, right? We're not going to spend, 2 hours, straight in the air. We're going to spend no more than 30 minutes or 40 minutes in the air, right? And then we're going to spend no more than 10 or 20 minutes on the ground before we get to our destination.
So I agree with you. That is way narrower. It's still a massive problem to
of course,
take on.
Of course. But we were talking about improvements in battery power, and that's one of the things that has enabled electric vehicles to emerge in a more important way in recent history than we had 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? Those improvements in efficiency of batteries are precisely the things we want to take advantage of here. And I think by narrowing the scope, right, even though it's still a very ambitious project, it goes from being so ambitious that who would take that on? It's too crazy to take on, to being okay, maybe we could make that work. Right? We want to go go ahead.
I was going to say, let's talk about like the practicality of, making money and pursuing a project like this, right? So I'm imagining an engineer that maybe even created a quadcopter as part of some engineering project at MIT or something, right? This would be much more manageable thing for them to do. But even at the same time, they would have to kind of start from nothing with it. So I think one question that's interesting, I'm just curious how we would approach it. Is it that you would actually try to do something that would make money from this from the get-go? Would you sort of dedicate your all 24/7 to it because that's what it would require to get a project like this off the ground? Or pardon the pun, but also, you know, like, is it about raising investment? Any thoughts about how we financially get started to actually start pursuing this project? How much focus and attention does the actual flying car part of it take?
I'm glad you asked this, because I actually think that you've hit on what I view as the most difficult part of the project, or potentially one of the most difficult parts of the project. I can conceive of a dozen different designs for the flying car, more than a dozen. I can conceive of an endless number, ranging from pretty low end and janky and low cost to super high end. No matter what I pick, it will require a significant amount of upfront R&D, and a significant amount of upfront investment, and also significant amounts of regulatory work and all this other stuff. And that actually is something that I think turns investors off, right? Investors tend to prefer to see businesses that are easier to validate than to commit, you know, a significant amount of capital upfront to something that seems pretty speculative. As you know, especially as you get more towards, you know, professional investors, VCs, right? As an entrepreneur, one of the things you really want to do to the greatest degree possible is validate your idea as quickly as possible, show that you can get traction as quickly as possible. And that's what in a sense de-risks your investors, right? Subsequent investors can come in and say, okay, I'm not investing in vaporware. I'm not investing in something that's just a pipe dream. I'm investing in something that has some sort of a track record. And with a project like this, you're not going to have that. You're going to have to find investors who are willing to, you know, take a meaningful risk up front. It's a very, you know, particular class of investor. And I think actually that is the most difficult, potentially the most difficult part, is that you have this 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, some number of years of upfront work before you're going to sell a single unit.
I would take a different approach. I agree with that completely. And for that reason, I would not directly take on trying to create a quadcopter. There are dozens of companies, probably even hundreds of companies, who have tried to do this. Several of them have failed, have gone out of business. I mentioned that Uber, they started it in 2016, I believe, their Elevate division. They just sold it in December 2020 to Joby Aviation. And the deals of the terms of the deal are a little fuzzy, but it came across to me like it wasn't like Uber recouped a whole lot of money from that. They actually had to invest 75 million into Joby Aviation as part of the deal. So all that to say, and there are people like Hyundai competing with this, Boeing, Airbus. There are these super well-financed organizations who are looking to solve this problem. They're going to all compete against each other. I would take the sell the shovel to the gold diggers approach. What are some ways in which you can support the infrastructure, this thing that is going to happen? I don't know which horse is going to win. I don't want to get into that horse race, but I can take advantage of the fact that that trend is going to happen. And it's probably something banal, right? Like, one thing that came to mind for me is creating a system, a systematized approach for landing pads, right? Even just like the color scheme or the marking, just something super basic that's a universal. These are what landing pads look like. It's very easy to recognize from any sort of low grade camera that you're going to have on a drone or on this vehicle. So stuff like that comes to mind as much more approachable, much higher likelihood of succeeding. You could always expand into creating the quadcopters, but man, I would go with the how do I help support the industry approach.
Yeah, there's go ahead, Dan.
I think in terms of getting a business off the ground faster, I think that what you're describing makes a lot of sense. Although I want to come back to in a moment another way potentially to get this off the ground a little bit faster, to remove some of those, you know, barriers that relate to needing a ton of capital up front. My concern about the components business is that if you look at other industries, you end up with situations where those sort of components businesses start out in pretty good shape, but then they start to the margins start to degrade fairly quickly unless you have something that's really special sauce. And the reason is that, you have a company like Boeing, for example, buying from you, and Boeing has a lot of market power. And what they're going to do is say, I need this component made. Great job, Dan. Glad you've made this. I'll buy it from you for 2 years. And in the back, the background, what they're doing is they're trying to find a way to get this made someplace else from somebody else at a lower cost, and basically compete me against that person, right? Against that company, degrade the margins. Then you end up with these sort of crummier returns on capital. I think that what you're describing makes a lot of sense if you have something where there's special sauce, where you can put some IP around it, and uh, and make it such that you're really the tastiest drink at the bar, that nobody wants anything else. But I think in the absence of that, I would rather be further up the food chain.
I want to share a quick example of exactly what you're talking about there. Tesla, when they created their autopilot software, they originally outsourced that to Mobileye, which is an Israeli-based company. And they did exactly what you said, where they worked with them for a few years, maybe even several years. And then Tesla developed their autonomous driving technology in-house and got rid of Mobileye as a partner. So that's definitely happens.
Yeah, I wish I knew the name of this fellow. There's an interesting story of a guy who he wanted to completely change his industry, and he was able not only to change his industry, having no expertise in this new field, but also kind of rise to the top of it within a year or two. And what the fellow did is he started hosting uh, networking events. I think through like Eventbrite or Meetup or whatever, in that industry. And he was just the host. He would just get together interesting experts and people who wanted to learn things and so on and so forth. And within a matter of a year or so, he started to be seen as an expert himself, just because he had been hosting these, and he had become an expert himself because he had been gathering information from folks along the way by interacting with them. And so this I could see as an interesting way to both educate yourself about this industry, meet all the key players, and start imagining who you want on your team and how you're going to plan your own company. Just host, flying car conventions, right? And there's a lot of ambition and money that people are looking to make in this. So, you could probably make some okay money hosting those type of events.
I think that's actually a very good idea. It's especially powerful for entrepreneurs who are particularly charismatic. So I know folks who have done that in other industries. Uh, in the Bitcoin industry in particular, I know of a handful of folks who really, because they are so tremendously charismatic, they've been able to do precisely that. And that's exactly how they got a great footing. So I think for the right personality, that's a terrific move, and a good way to sort of, get things off the ground, and learn as much as you can about the industry in a reasonably compressed amount of time.
So, by the way, I'll bring in some little tidbits that I have from the history of the flying car. Ford actually had not a quadcopter, but like a tricopter kind of a deal. I think at the moment it was just like it was just a concept car. I don't think they actually built it, but it's so interesting to see that, the things that we see today were imagined 50 years ago. And that might be also just an interesting direction to start. Well, I think what that brings up here, and I think it's an interesting question to ask of you, Dan, in light of your experience with crypto and all this, is like, is there a lesson to be learned about how far is something actually in the future, and when are you getting into it at the right time? It's like, is now the right time to get into flying cars? Is it 10 years from now? If you go into it now, what part of it do you get into? Just like in crypto, 8 years ago or 12 years ago, or I don't think it was around 12 years ago, but like around 10 years ago, what could you have gotten into in that space that wouldn't kind of fail just because it was too soon, right? We don't want to fail because we're too soon with what we're trying to do, even though we're ambitious.
I think this is a terrific question, and I'm going to pick on an example, and the example is quantum computing. And I have read more articles than I can count that talk about quantum computing being, 10-ish years away. And the problem that these articles all have is that they don't, the authors of these articles, the thing that they're missing is that what's really required in order to get quantum computing to be mainstream is not an engineering breakthrough, but a physics breakthrough. And that's much more difficult. So I think it brings up this question of what breakthroughs do you need? And I'll give you another example in the field of semiconductor production. If you go back, 10 years or so, there was a lot of discussion about the need for extreme ultraviolet lithography, which is this type of lithography that you use, and it is used now to produce semiconductors at very, very tiny line, very, very tiny feature sizes, right, in the single digit nanometers. And again, there was a lot of discussion about, oh, this is around the corner, it's coming soon. It turned out that it needed some real serious breakthroughs before it was ready to happen. We've seen similar things with LiDAR. LiDAR is not really ready. It's like sort of ready. It's like sort of, right. The question is, and I don't even want to break it down between needing a physics breakthrough versus an engineering breakthrough. Even that, I think, perhaps is a mistake. I think the bigger question is what breakthroughs are required, and how do we estimate, what is in front of us? And I think if you look at sort of casual commentary, it's almost always an underestimate because it doesn't get into the nitty gritty of what's actually required to make it work. And that's where I think you really need to do a lot of difficult analysis and say, what will, and look, electric cars, similarly, right? What was really needed, and I'm going to say electric cars are mainstream-ish now. They're pretty close, right? What was really needed was a breakthrough in battery technology, and that didn't happen overnight. We've seen the cost, per joule of storage, decline. I'm showing with my hand, kind of like a line that goes from top left to bottom right over time. It didn't happen in a step function overnight, but you had to sort of be aware of what was ahead of us and what was required in order to understand, whether it made sense to invest and in what, and the thing in which it would make sense to invest.
Question we often like to try to cover is who's your first customer? So I see that Larry Page is, got his own small collection of flying cars and even invested in some of these businesses. Is this the type of thing where that's who we're aiming for? Is, someone who has most of the, has a share of most of the wealth in the world? Are these the people we have to talk to first when we're trying to sell the product?
I think so. And I don't even necessarily think that's bad. I think that having something be an aspirational purchase almost makes it more attractive at times. Right? If it's aspirational but not crazy, right? So if it's aspirational and completely insane, the $100 million mansion in the hills of Goa, right? That's aspirational and crazy. It's beyond the reach of the common person. But if it's just so aspirational that it's not completely out of reach, but would require a lot of savings, then people start getting more excited about it. And they say, well, it's too expensive right now, but wait 5 years, wait 7 years, some amount of time, and it won't be so expensive. So I think you do want to sell initially to, those who have, significant amount of assets or significant amount of income. And that's a very reasonable place to start.
Another approach there is to not necessarily sell direct to consumer, but create a shuttle service, let's say. So if you're going from JFK to Midtown Manhattan, that is not easy to do any way you slice it, via subway or car, and takes a long time. VTOL, which is, we didn't actually mention that acronym, vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, sometimes also called quadcopters. They they're projected to cost $60 to get from JFK to Midtown Manhattan if you achieve, the battery density and the scale and the uptime, everything that we're talking about. So again, within 10 years, this is going to be happening. There are a lot of ways that you can probably take advantage and help accelerate this transition. Hopefully, this gave you, the listener, some ideas for how to take that on. We are coming up on time. Dan, where can people go to learn more about you?
So I run a business right now called Atacama, and we make some really interesting encryption software for data at rest. So for files, for example, you can go to atacama.com, which is ATAKAMA.com, and you can learn more about us. The really cool thing that we do, or one of the really cool things that we do, is we enable you to encrypt your data without the use of passwords or codes or something that you're going to potentially forget or lose. Which is something that really is not commonplace nowadays. We also enable you to share that data very seamlessly with other people securely in ways that are not otherwise achievable. You can search through your data while it's encrypted without decrypting it. So we're a cryptography company, and we make some pretty cool software, and you can learn more about it by visiting our website. And drop us a line if you have questions. We'd love to hear from you.
Great.
I didn't want to stop, Chris. I wanted to talk more about how we're going to start this thing.
I know we all do. I mean, it's so much fun.
We can talk. Listen, I'm glad to talk more about it. I have been obsessed with this idea since I was a child, and my obsession with the idea isn't going away. So even having a few minutes to chat about it is, a fun time for me.
One other thing that I'll add is Ethan put this video in our notes, and we'll put it in the show notes so you can check it out. There's personal VTOL or quadcopters. They're basically giant drones that an individual can sit in and steer. And it's pretty cool to watch. I mean, you're not going to go super far. You're not going to go from the airport to to Midtown Manhattan, but they look like a ton of fun. So if you have an opportunity to check that out, or we all may be riding in one of those at some point. I mean, this episode got me pumped just doing that kind of research.
Well, luckily I can leave all the engineering and tech work to you two, and I'll be the charismatic guy, and I'll put the conference together.
That sounds good. Sounds like a team. We'd have
every company needs that guy. Every company needs that guy.
We'd have some dad jokes to hold it all together. Be that glue.
Right.
All right, Daniel, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure on this side.
All right, I'll sign us off. Facebook.
Sounds good. All right, hit stop recording here.